Welcome to the Definitive Analysis of Tenet. This series of videos is meant to provide a more complete understanding of the film's narrative and conceptual elements. It's a research tool to be used as a companion to the original movie. In this episode, I cover the film's intro as well as the opening sequence, which consists of the opera siege, rail yards, and afterlife scenes. If you're looking for something in particular, use the chapter markers in the timeline below. Let's get into it. Before the movie proper even starts, we get our first conceptual element in the form of the Warner Brothers logo appearing in red, followed by the logo for Syncope, the Nolan's production company, appearing in blue. Their fanfare, the audio which accompanies those elements, is played backwards. If you jump to the end of the film, after the credits, you'll find that it's bookended with the Warner Brothers logo in blue. This is a pretty simple nod to the fact that, in the Tenet universe, red is used to denote moving forward through time, and blue is used to denote moving backwards through time. As for why Nolan chose those colors specifically, it could simply be that they're easily recognizable and distinguishable from each other. Red and blue sit near opposing ends of the visible light spectrum, so we tend to naturally perceive them as a conflicting pair, which is why they're so often used as such. The most popular fan theory around the colors suggests that it's related to the Doppler effect. In simple terms, this is where an object moving away from the viewer undergoes what's called red shift, while an object moving towards the viewer undergoes blue shift. Without getting too deep into astrophysics, the universe expands and objects move away from each other as time moves forward, thus red for forward time. If you invert that, run time backwards, the universe contracts and objects move closer together, thus blue for inverted. The opera siege is, in my opinion, the most challenging scene to fully wrap your head around. And that's because so much of the setup and motivations for it to happen are never revealed. But on the surface, the scene is extremely simple to follow. It serves as little more than an introduction to a few things. First, the protagonist, a CIA operative who's immediately shown to be both physically and mentally adept in a military field operation, as well as being driven by a sense of honor and duty. Second, an object referred to as the package, which is currently understood to be weapons-grade nuclear material. And third, both the protagonist and the audience are given a soft introduction to inversion via a backwards-moving bullet and the mysterious stranger who catches it. And that's pretty much all you need to understand in order to get through the movie, which is one reason why the details of everything else are omitted. The other reason is to give people like us something to ponder and theorycraft around. But there is a bit of knowable information that I think it's helpful to inventory first, primarily regarding the parties involved. They're sent in to take control of the opera house by force, but they're easily neutralized by the Ukrainian SWAT team. They arrive on the scene and immediately flood the floor area with gas, which knocks out the audience and orchestra, then engage the terrorists with gunfire. Some of the team members plant bombs around the first floor, while others sweep the VIP areas. These two speak Ukrainian when dropping off the CIA team at mission start, and then switch to Russian when capturing the protagonist and another CIA agent at mission end instead of helping them escape. The protagonist and a small team tasked with extracting the package, first and foremost, and either killing or extracting an undercover asset. Referred to in the screenplay as well-dressed man, this agent has brokered some type of deal involving the package. This is the guy in the box with well-dressed man, often mistaken for a Ukrainian official, but this is the insignia and dress uniform of a colonel general in the Russian military. He appears momentarily to save the protagonist by unshooting an inverted round through a Ukrainian SWAT team member. Okay, beyond this point, there are no verifiably correct answers, but I've spent a lot of time developing an understanding that relies on the provided clues as much as possible. So, if you'll indulge me. Inverted Tenet forces lift 241, the package, from a remote Russian missile station, then revert with it to conventional entropy.
In 2008, a remote Russian missile station was overwhelmed and held for a week. When the station was retaken, 241 on one warhead was 3/4 of a kilo lighter. The missing 241 surfaced at the opera house siege in Kiev on the 14th.
It's transferred to Tenet-friendly CIA hands as weapons-grade plutonium, which they're instructed to sell to Andrei Sator. Since Sator is unreachable directly and averse to CIA dealings,
I wouldn't partner with you!
They have well-dressed man pose as a private arms dealer and work through someone approachable, the Russian general. He brokers a deal, and a handoff is arranged for the opera house on the 14th. Sator then learns that the seller is actually CIA. He won't show up for the exchange as planned, but can't simply blow off the deal because he needs 241 to complete the algorithm. So he develops a plan around the knowledge that it will be at the Opera House on the 14th. He shadow finances and equips a group of militant Russian loyalists. They don't know they're working for Sator, just that they're expected to carry out an attack on the National Opera House on the 14th. Specifically, they're instructed to secure the floor and the VIP boxes, and then ensure the Russian general's safe exit. The Russian general knows the plan, which is why he's relaxed when the terrorists enter. He's waiting for them to secure the building, at which point he'll have Well-Dressed Man gather 241 and they'll exit.
The siege is a blind for them to vanish you.
At least, that's the plan. But Sator knows the CIA is likely to learn of this plan, so he hedges his bets. He leaks the information about the terrorist attack to British intelligence as though it's part of a Russian plan to abduct Well-Dressed Man.
Andre lives playing one government off the other,
knowing they will pass the information on to their American counterparts.
He's tapped into the intelligence services. I've warned them he's feeding them rubbish, but they don't seem to care.
Additionally, he has 2 of his men pose as Ukrainians, capable of embedding and extracting a CIA response team. Now, if the CIA fails to extract Well-Dressed Man, Sator gets 241 from the Russian general. If the CIA succeeds, he lifts it from the extraction team. As expected, the CIA plans their exfiltration operation, where the protagonist is instructed to gain access, acquire 241, and either kill or extract Well-Dressed Man.
Bring you in or kill you. Have 2 minutes. Make up your mind.
The only thing Sator couldn't foresee is that Priya, acting on instructions from the future, would warn Ukrainian intelligence of the terrorist threat and to secure the service tunnels at the Opera House. It's worth noting that Priya does this thinking that it will result in Sator getting 241, which is the outcome she's after.
You want Sator to get the last section.
That is the only way he'll bring together the other 8.
She has no idea that she's being used by the future protagonist.
I realized I wasn't working for you. We've both been working for me.
To set up his own recruitment, and to put 241 into Ukrainian hands so they'll later transport it through Tallinn. After receiving Priya's tip, Ukrainian authorities devise a shrewd political plan called a false flag operation to take advantage of the situation. A SWAT team is instructed to gas the floor while a small contingent sweeps the boxes, evacuating VIPs. The forward group will then eliminate the terrorists, plant explosives, and exit. Making it appear as though innocent civilians were killed by pro-Russian extremists would generate support for Ukraine, as well as opposition to Russia, even more so if we make the reasonable assumption that the audience and orchestra are international groups. So with these plans in place, the Russian general and Well-Dressed Man arrive separately, with the latter planting 241 at coat check, then taking the ticket to his box. They wait for Sator to arrive, though the Russian general knows he's not coming. Terrorists enter and take control of the floor, but before they can establish a perimeter or even get to the VIP boxes, the Ukrainian SWAT team has already arrived. The immediate response makes it clear that they were prepared and waiting close by. The protagonist team slips in and waits as the floor is gassed, and it's at this point that the Russian general becomes uncomfortable and draws his sidearm. Seeing the audience drop unconscious tells him, A, the response team is somehow already on site, and B, they aren't even attempting to contact the terrorists to negotiate a peaceful resolution. The protagonist beelines it to the boxes, arriving before the terrorists or SWAT. He kills the guard and knocks the Russian general unconscious. The protagonist tells Well-Dressed Man that his cover is blown, and he responds,
"But I established contact."
Which tells me he's the seller in the 241 deal. If he was buying, he already has the coat check ticket. His job is done. He can just get up, grab 241 and leave. His response tells me that his job wasn't done yet, and that establishing contact was a challenging part of it. So, who's involved with Russia, interested in 241, and difficult to contact? They head towards Kochek, and the protagonist encounters a Ukrainian SWAT planting a bomb, and it's clear that he expects the protagonist, who is posing as Ukrainian SWAT, to help him plant more. This is highly unusual and causes the protagonist to not trust his exit. Ironically, it's because he thinks his escorts are Ukrainian, not because he actually knows what they're up to. He grabs 241 from Kochek, where we see it still in the blue duffel bag the inverted Tenet team used when they took it from the missile station. They meet up with the rest of the team, where Well-Dressed Man and Target swap clothes. The protagonist and Target are heading back to the floor to clear the remaining bombs, while everyone else takes 241 to Well-Dressed Man's exit.
Take this. Take him, take his exit. I don't trust us anymore.
While the protagonist and Target are clearing bombs from the floor, we get our soft introduction to Inversion and Neil when a bullet flies out of a hole in blue concrete, through a hostile SWAT, and into the gun of a masked stranger. The stranger runs off, and there's a close-up of a talisman hanging from his backpack. More on this in a minute. I want to wrap up the scene first. The The protagonist and target throw the gathered explosives where they'll do minimal damage, exit the opera house, and jump back into the van to discover that their exit is indeed compromised. Those Ukrainian escorts are now speaking Russian, and they know Target is not the undercover asset they were expecting. They shoot Target in the leg, most likely to minimize any threat a 2 versus 2 situation might present, and then drive off with the 2 prisoners. Off-screen, the other half of the team is intercepted by Ukrainian forces, who are waiting in the service tunnels, thanks to the heads-up from Priya. And that's the scene. Jumping back to Neil now, I have to point out that this moment is more complicated than it might seem, for 2 reasons. First, we're never presented with a reason for Neil to be here. He's not part of any of the teams on site, and the protagonist doesn't even realize that this masked stranger is Neil until the end of the movie. Second, Neil is clearly moving forward, but he catches an inverted round. Now, the only way I've been able to make sense of both of these gaps is to assume that, in the protagonist's future, the protagonist instructs Neil to be at the opera house during the siege and to take an inverted sidearm with him. Anything else either falls apart under scrutiny or requires jumping through some very odd hoops. Regarding Neil's backpack token, its purpose in the film is to provide a visual marker, to lead the audience to connect the guy who just saved the protagonist's life in the opera house to the guy who takes a bullet while unlocking a gate near the end of the film, so that when we finally see Neil holding that bag, we understand that he was/will be the masked stranger who's been looking out for the protagonist all along. As to its meaning or symbolism, it appears to be an Indian ritual protection thread called a kautuka, with an Indian British coin tied around the end of it. These are often given to loved ones and are traditionally believed to provide protection. I've read theories trying to connect it to the Chinese thread of fate, or claiming that it's the cable in the dead drop apparatus at the end of the movie, but I think its only purpose symbolically is to connect the name Neil to its Hindu meaning, which is blue. This would seem to reference the fact that Neil is the blue team in the protagonist's grand pincer, which the events of this movie are only the first half of.
Control operations to temporal pincer. Whose? Yours! You're only halfway there.
Anyway, I don't want to get too far ahead. There's so much more about Neil and his name coming later, and we haven't even met him in the movie yet. In this scene, we're introduced to the CIA challenge.
We live in a twilight world.
And its corresponding password.
And there are no friends at dusk.
It's used in-universe as a way of showing your CIA credentials without exposing yourself. Symbolically, the phrases are so vague that you could imagine at least a dozen ways to connect it to themes, organizations, ideologies, narrative elements. The list goes on. So, while I'm certain there's a reason Christopher Nolan chose these words, I'm not going to pretend that there's a theory that makes more sense than a handful of others. And maybe that's exactly why he chose them, because they're non-specific, yet they seem to capture some undefinable essence of the film. One final note of interest, the opera siege seems to be heavily influenced by the Moscow theater hostage crisis of 2002. Chechen terrorists seized the Dubrovka theater during a performance, taking 912 hostages. Among them were foreign nationals from 14 different countries, as well as a general in Russia's law enforcement agency, MVD. After 4 days of negotiations, Russian forces enacted a plan that involved pumping sleeping gas into the building before storming it. The protagonist and target have been captured and are being tortured by the escort driver from earlier in an attempt to extract information as to the whereabouts of the undercover agent. We're introduced to the silver CIA-issue suicide pill, which will come up again later in the film. The protagonist is tortured for roughly 18 hours, and when he fears that he may finally break, he manages to get the other agent's pill in his mouth and kills himself, as far as he knows. The scene ends here, but off-screen, the protagonist somehow ends up on a boat in Tenet hands in the next scene. The simplest explanation is that a Tenet team is instructed to wait nearby for the protagonist to go down. At that point, they move in, eliminate Sator's men, and extract the protagonist. When you consider this scene in conjunction with my opera siege theory, it becomes clear why Sator didn't invert for a pincer on the opera house. We've seen how Sator operates a pincer. He stays hidden on forward pass, receiving updates on events, so he's ready and safe to invert if necessary. Since he receives no updates from inside the opera house, he has limited intel on those events. The only information he receives is that neither well-dressed man nor 241 exited via the planned van extraction, and that an interrogation was unfruitful. So it makes sense that he's in Kyiv during the siege, as we learn later in the film.
It's the 14th, 10 days ago. He was in Ukraine.
Ready to invert if necessary, but ultimately never shows up in the scene. Inversion would be pointless, as he has no ball to follow. Sator doesn't even appear to know where 241 ended up until the protagonist tells him about the Talon transport.
The 241 is being transported to Northern Europe.
And since Tenet eliminates the escorts, there's no one linked to Sator who would recognize the protagonist when he later appears in Sator's life via Cat. Thematically, the trains moving in opposite directions is a pretty clear reference to objects and people moving through time in opposing directions. The interrogator literally moving the clock backwards is such an obvious reference that I'm not even sure it qualifies as a thematic element, but I'll mention it anyway. The protagonist is not dead, just grumpy. Faye, who appears to be a CIA handler, briefs us. The protagonist has been in a medically induced coma. The suicide pills were fake, a test to see if an agent would choose death over giving up intel. And since the protagonist passed, he's being recruited into an organization so secretive that Faye only shares their handshake, password,
Tenet,
and mission objective: to save the world. It's important to note that the protagonist we're following didn't need to pass the test to satisfy the future version of himself. He needs to pass it so that he understands the stakes involved, and to know without a doubt that he's capable of sacrificing his life for the greater good.
We all believe we'd run into the burning building, but until we feel that heat, we can never know. You do.
This is why I suggested earlier that the Tenet team was instructed to wait for the test to complete before extracting the protagonist. Faye also tells him that his team was killed.
Private Russians, we think.
Which is echoed by Priya later in the film.
Sator tried to lift the only loose 241 from under a CIA team at the Operation Key. He got the team, not the 241.
We accept this on first watch, just like the protagonist does, but on rewatch, this explanation becomes problematic. We know that 241 left the Opera House with the protagonist's team, and that it ended up with Ukrainian security services. To get private Russians killing the protagonist's team in the middle of that, you either need the Ukrainians to intercept the team, take 241, but not take the Americans smuggling weapons-grade plutonium, as far as they know, into custody, or kill them. Or you need Sator's men to have eyes on 241 at some point, but Sator chooses to not pincer the moment and secure 241, even though that's exactly how he handles the situation in Talon? Neither of those assumptions holds water. So let me explain how I see it. Faye and Priya are lying, and it actually makes sense for them to lie. More specifically, Faye is repeating a lie that Priya fed him. He's just low-level Tenet and not trusted with much of anything.
That test you passed? Not everybody does.
So the point of this interaction is to pull the protagonist into the Tenet fold and start him on a path that Priya knows leads to Sator. Faye placing blame for the CIA team's death on private Russians plants a seed against the antagonist they're about to send the protagonist after. Later, Priya waters that seed by filling in the anonymous private Russians with the name Sator, something the protagonist and audience were most likely already doing at that point because we've already accepted that it was private Russians. The lie confirms what we wanted to believe we'd figured out on our own, and it adds an element of vengeance to the protagonist's motivation to take down Sator. It's quite clever and manipulative, which is exactly how Priya operates. The handler's name, Faye, is likely a reference to theoretical physicist Richard Feynman, who can be tied to the ideas in Tenet in a number of ways. One of them is mentioned directly by Neil later in the movie, so here I'll point out that he was a member of Oppenheimer's Los Alamos team, which developed the atomic bomb, and he spent time developing safety protocols for the handling of weapons-grade nuclear material. He was also notably devoted to his wife, who was severely ill with tuberculosis, which could be seen as an inverted version of Sator and Kat's marriage. That's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button to activate the algorithm. No, not that algorithm. The YouTube one that tells it to recommend this video to others. Be sure you're subscribed and have notifications enabled so you know when the next video goes live. And as always, thank you for watching.